Hello, Marvel Legends, or more specifically, hello, Patreon Legends. How about that? My first Patreon video. So let's not beat around the bush. Let's do this. It is the 1994 Spider-Man animated series, episode 1. Sorry, I'm so excited. I can't even get my words out straight. Are we going to edit this? No, it's Patreon, but come on, I'm still keeping it real. So I'm keeping the same backdrop as well. We spared no expense. So, Animated Spider-Man, Series 1, Episode 1 from 1994. This is what got me into Spider-Man. This is what got me into Marvel. This is what got me into Marvel Legends. This is what started it all. When I first saw this cartoon, I was like, oh, this is just awesome. I love Spider-Man because I recognized Spider-Man, but I didn't know what the character was like. I didn't really know anything about him. And then I see the character of Spider-Man, I'm like, well, that's kind of me. I say to myself, you project yourself onto all sorts of things, whether it's accurate or not. But I went full Bart Simpson. I was like, it's like they saw our lives and put them right up on screen. So guys, what I'm going to do is I'm going to watch the episode and I'm going to sort of pause it and then comment back. So it's kind of a watch along, but without you just staring at me, staring at the screen. So the editing might be a little bit choppy, but let's see how this goes.
New York City.
So we open on Spider-Man looking out over New York, and that in itself is just an iconic shot. And you hear Peter Parker's voice, and the voice acting is just, it's what I hear whenever I read comics now. When I read comics, I hear this Peter Parker's voice. And it's great because he's not a kid. This is Spider-Man, and I dig that. And we instantly get one of the first shots that we will see a million times, the whipping hand. It's like, boy, they're going to get a lot of use out of this. And as the camera pans across New York and we see this nice street scene, the music, the orchestral score really starts to, well, it doesn't show up. It doesn't show up too much. It just sort of adds to the ambience. But when you really listen to it, it's a really nice score. They've gone an extra mile. It's not just like a generic kind of thing. They got a good composer to give a real sort of New York City sense to it. And as we pan down to the sewers, we get this scene with these two workmen, and there's actually some quite fun banter that, again, it's slightly above what you would expect from just a generic kids cartoon. They're two guys talking about the weather, and one guy saying that he used to work in TV, and he was like, I actually used to be a TV executive. And I guess that's kind of like a fun little in-joke in the TV creative process. It's like a TV executive ends up working in a sewer. There you go. But of course, both men are suddenly terrified by the sight of, well, what is it? Okay, we get a little bit of a glimpse. We know what it is. After all, the episode is called Night of the Lizard, but we haven't had the full proper reveal yet, so I'm going to hold off. I'm going to hold off on the figure, just like I held off on Spider-Man, because we saw like a brief bit of Spidey swinging through the streets, but we haven't had a big old Spider-Man reveal. So I do have the figures down here, but we're going to get to those later. In the meantime, though, the workmen have been, they've had an encounter with something in the sewer, and they race out for dear life. We see a reptilian hand reach up after them, and these guys are freaked, and this is where we get our first real sort of action scene with Spider-Man. So as the guys try to escape and get in their van, one of them actually gets grabbed by the lizard's hand and dragged down into the sewer. And what's really cool is, like, you don't know what has happened to this guy. It's like, watching it sort of now, you're like, okay, well, they're not going to murder someone on a kid's TV show, but you're a kid watching this on Saturday, you can quite easily, assume that this guy might have been, like, dragged down and horribly mutilated. It's like, that's pretty brutal. This is coming just off the heels of the Batman animated series, which was so beautifully adult and mature in its content. This is more cartoony, more kid-friendly, but there's not violence as such, but there's implied violence. If you want to be kind of creative with how you interpret it, it's like, ooh, there's some good potential for, like, quite extreme stuff. So that was pretty cool. Also, I was noticing with the banter with the workmen, and also just the animation style and the fact that it does get kind of dark, I was getting serious real Ghostbusters vibes from this. I love the real Ghostbusters in the 80s. That cartoon was so ahead of its time, I feel. As a kid's Saturday morning cartoon show, or for us watching it in the UK, it was after school. But the tone of that, the scariness was real. The ghosts were scary, like they dealt with death and sort of terrifying implications of stuff. And I felt like a vibe of that from this opening scene, this opening episode. So much good stuff. So now, as the terrified workman is frantically racing through the streets in his van, we get the proper action scene introduction of Spider-Man. So of course, what better Marvel legend to sort of, what am I trying to say? Represent, there we go, to represent Spidey in the cartoon than the retro Spider-Man right here. I feel, actually, the retro Spider-Man does a good job of, again, symbolizing the animated Spider-Man, because one thing I always thought about animated Spider-Man is he's a little bulkier than I would really like. He's actually quite hench, quite jacked up, the animated Spider-Man, and I was like, I always thought Spidey should be more lithe and limber, but it's what they went for. And actually, the retro wave Spidey actually is a little thicker. You've got the pizza Spider-Man, and I think that's the perfect Spider-Man physique with that lean, lanky kind of look to him. But this guy is a little bit thicker, a little bit more sort of solid, heavier upper body, and that actually works really well. Oops, excuse me. That works really well to represent the Spidey that we see in the animated series. So as far as a comparison goes, retro Spider-Man here, mwah, perfect, great representation. We're off to a good start already. So here we go. We're in the scene where Spider-Man is, it's so perfect. What does he do? He jumps on top of the speeding car and looks down to talk to the driver. Like, how many times have we seen that done? Especially, I mean, it springs to mind the awful, admittedly, Amazing Spider-Man 2 with Andrew Garfield. That's how the movie starts, with him messing about with the Rhino in almost the exact same kind of situation. This here, honestly, in the cartoon, I feel it's done a lot better. Because in Amazing Spider-Man 2, like, the Rhino and his goons are firing automatic weapons and, like, causing chaos and carnage and killing people, or potentially killing people, and Spidey's like, hey, let's joke around and be funny. It's like, no, dude, you need to stop this now, okay? At least here, he's just trying to calm down a scared guy, although I don't think this is going to do anything to help calm him. Oh, also, we get our first glimpse of the 3D integration, and it doesn't age great. Watching it at the time, in the early 90s, this was very impressive. I was like, wow, okay, this is three-dimensional. This is before Toy Story even came out. So it was kind of cool, but it definitely became something that the animators leaned on quite a lot. You see the same 3D shots a lot over and over and over again. But, you know, excuse me, when you're making a Saturday morning cartoon show, you gotta cut corners a little bit here and there. These episodes take so long to make that if you can reuse some footage, I'll forgive it, especially if the story around it is gripping, and this often is. So with Spidey holding on to the top of the van, they crash through a barricade and plummet into the river, and that is where we go to the Spider-Man opening theme. Oh my god, this is it more iconic than the X-Men theme? Maybe. For me personally, I love it, because X-Men is kind of like operatic and whereas Spider-Man is very kind of techno. I gotta be careful. I started doing that there and I instantly just wanted to do the entire intro song. Apparently, I think the guitar is Steve... Oh gosh, the name, just not Joe Perry. Joe Perry from Aerosmith, I think, composed this, unless I'm massively mistaken, which I might be. But yeah, this just sets the tone for the style of this show so well. It's dramatic, it's exciting, it's modern, it's kind of futuristic at the time. It's really kind of cutting edge. That's the phrase I was looking for, cutting edge. And then splicing all the shots of action into the opening. And of course, you see they clearly put more effort into some scenes than others, and that's fine. They want to have like their showcase scenes. So some of the scenes that they show in the opening sequence with Spider-Man flipping and jumping and ducking tentacles and jumping away from bombs, the animation is just so gorgeous. So yeah, I could happily watch this over and over, and throughout the course of these Patreon episodes, we will. Also, I still distinctly remember seeing that opening sequence for the first time, seeing those opening credits, and that shot of Venom at the end. I didn't know who Venom was as a character, but just something about seeing that thing at the end there was like, whoa, what is that? I want to know what that thing is. Also, I can just imagine being a Spider-Man fan at the time and knowing all these characters, and because this is before the days of the internet, you don't necessarily know who's going to be in this show, and you probably think, like, oh, they're definitely going to have the retro characters, you're going to have Doc Ock and what have you, but then right at the end you see Venom pop up and you must have been like, oh, they got Venom in here. So we get back to the story at hand, and Spider-Man has, of course, rescued the guy from the van. And they had this little exchange where he's like, the red eyes, man, the red eyes. And Spidey, we get that instant sense of the sarcastic, glib, funny Spider-Man. He's like, yeah, sure, whatever. Just make sure the cops don't blame this on me. Which, again, is great because we're actually establishing this is not a young, naive kid who's just becoming Spider-Man for the first time. This is clearly a Spider-Man who has been around for a while now. And that's so good to see because we always get young kid Spider-Man. I want to see a movie, I want to see a TV show where it's Spider-Man who's been doing this for a while. He knows what's what. That's why I loved the Peter B. Parker in Spider-Verse movie, because you see finally a Spider-Man who's like, yeah, I've been around the block a few times, this is not my first rodeo. I've been Spider-Man a long time. So it's great that we already establish, in the short scene, we establish what do we know about Spider-Man? He's heroic, he's sarcastic, he's funny, and he has a contentious relationship with the police who perceive him as a bad guy. So much good storytelling in such a short time. And the next shot, Daily Bugle, and more great character introductions. We've got Joe Robbie Robertson just being that kind of sensible mentor, editor-in-chief, and then of course we get Jonah Jameson instantly with his Parker! Not quite the J.K. Simmons style, but establishing the mood of the character. He says something along the lines of, if you ever got here on time, you know what was happening, which is like no wasted motion. Like we instantly establish Jonah Jameson's relationship with Peter Parker and the dynamic. And speaking of Jonah Jameson, we have our kit bashed Jonah Jameson figure here. Again, this is my kind of ultimate kit bash. This is the kit bashiest kit bash. We have 5 figures going on in this. We have Claw from the MCU line. We have the Jonah Jameson head from the comedian figure. We've got the forearms from 6-Armed Spider-Man. We have the Daily Bugle from Gwen Stacy. And we have the gripping hand from Shang-Chi. I was about to say Iron Fist. No, not Iron Fist. But yeah, this is a figure which I think, if rumours are to be believed, which they often are, the rumour mill is pretty good with Marvel Legends, we're going to be getting a proper retro Jameson figure. But I gotta say, they're going to have to work real hard to do better than what we have here, because this is legit. This is really, really good. So if we can get another Jameson, I don't feel like I need one, because this is fantastic, but you know me. I'll happily take another action figure. Also, people have done some great kit bashes with the Lewis from Ant-Man body, because that with the blue blazer and the khaki trousers, or pants for you Americans listening, which at the moment, with my first episode here on Patreon, I know there's literally one. That makes a great kit bash as well. Not only Jonah though, but we get Eddie Brock. So the fans of the comics must have been so happy to see Eddie Brock walk in and instantly start talking trash with Peter Parker. So, of course we have Eddie Brock. Of course, this is later Eddie Brock. This is full-on Venom symbiote Eddie Brock. But we have the head. So this represents, younger, not completely psychotic Eddie Brock. But again, instantly in this scene, we establish what do we know about Eddie Brock. He's bigger and more sort of aggressive than Peter Parker. He's very antagonistic to him, and he clearly has a chip on his shoulder. I wonder if that's going to come into play later. And of course, the final member in this scene is Peter Parker himself. Again, this figure from the animated retro wave. And with this kind of jacket, shirt, like he does look straight out of the cartoon. It's kind of funny that, again, just being an animation sort of trope, Peter Parker wears the same top every episode, every time. He only has one thing in his wardrobe, which is the green, blue, and white stripe, top. What do you call that? It's not a tank top. I forget words. Words are hard. But I think this, because it has a very retro feel, I think that the face is a bit goofy on this, but I don't mind it. It's kind of kitsch and campy, but perfectly represents Peter Parker. So that's our Daily Bugle lineup here, and it's fun with the dynamic in the office. When Brock antagonizes Peter Parker, JJ immediately sides with Brock. He sort of puts his hand on his shoulder. He's like, "This is a real reporter here." But again, Peter Parker is not a little bitch. He actually fires back at Brock. When he makes some jab about, if this story is a wild goose chase, then actually, Brock, you're exactly the kind of person I'd send on a wild goose chase. It's bants. It's bants, and you got to love banter if you're here at Model Behaviour. We're here for the bants. The Duke of Banterbury right here. Anyway, let's carry on. Finally, before we leave this scene, we have that one final great dynamic where basically Jonah sides with Peter when Peter mentions that Dr. Kurt Connors, is at Empire State and is his tutor. JJ immediately sides with Peter, and he's like, "Sorry, Brock, you're out. Peter's in." So already we've planted the seeds of resentment inside Eddie Brock. And next we have a lovely little scene at the Parker household with Peter and Aunt May. We're introduced to Aunt May, and I like the fact that even though she's elderly, she's not like a withered old Skeksis. She's just not even elderly, a mature lady, I guess. They DH her far more like in later iterations of Spider-Man, but this is fine. But we instantly establish she is doting on Peter. Peter loves her to death, and she's struggling financially, and Peter knows this, and he has that sense of responsibility, which of course we always know is key to Spider-Man, is the sense of responsibility. So he sees the bills that she's trying to hide from him, and he's like, right, as JJ said, there's a $1,000 bonus to anyone who can get a picture of the lizard. Let's do this. So we see Peter in the sewer investigating the lizard, and we get a little shot of the spider beam, the spider symbol, whatever you want to call it, the spider light that he flashes from his belt, which is so infrequently, rarely used. I was really surprised to see it make an appearance in the very first episode, but that's kind of cool. And also we get a wonderful, awful spider pun where he's thinking to himself, maybe this lizard is a myth, and then he finds a footprint and he's like, unless I'm mistaken. Bravo. Chef's kiss. Mwah. I'm here for the puns. So we go now to Empire State University, where Peter meets up with Deborah Whitman, who's a character who's not very commonly used or very frequently seen, even in the comics themselves. But we establish our dynamic here, where he even describes her as the little sister that he never wanted. But they have a good back and forth, where he shows her the picture of the lizard, and she suggests, maybe it's bipedal. And, it shows that she actually has some intelligence and agency as a character in her own right. And also we see that Eddie Brock is, skulking around there as well, doing his own investigative reporting. Again, putting him at loggerheads with Peter Parker. And like any good horror movie, there's a power cut, or as Peter refers to it as, a brownout. And to be honest, if I was being stalked by a giant 7-foot-tall man lizard, I think I'd be in danger of a brownout too. So now we have our first confrontation almost with the lizard. They go into Kurt Connors' lab and it's all dark, and there is some big hulking creature there with something in its arms. And of course they assume like, oh, what is this thing? And it's got Dr. Connors in its arms. We know better. So, of course, it leaps out the window, and Peter, being the hero that he is, runs after it and is about to lift up his shirt and don his Spider-Man costume right in front of Deborah Whitman. But she's like, no, don't leave me alone. And it's like, yeah, Peter, don't, also have some common sense. But they have a little flirty banter. She's like, oh my gosh, that was so brave of you. And he's like, oh, well, it's nothing really. So believing that Dr. Connors has been kidnapped, we flash back to Peter Parker remembering a past event with Connors where it is them experimenting in the science lab with a lab rat, or a mouse maybe, I can't tell. But they inject it with a formula and it regrows a missing limb. And of course, Doc Connors with his missing arm. Right arm. He's like, yes, now with what we've discovered, perhaps we can find a way to regrow limbs for people who have lost them in accidents and what have you. Funny that the first memory that would come to mind that in Peter is the one in which they're experimenting with lizard DNA. But what I like about this is it shows and establishes to us that Peter Parker is not just a superhero and a college student, he's actually like a brilliant scientist as well. And now we have the scene which I feel sets the tone for why this series is so good and why it grabbed my attention the second I started watching it. We have the moment where Spider-Man goes to the home of Kurt Connors to see his family, to tell them what's happened, warn them they might be in danger, say that Dr. Connors is missing. But before then, I'm getting ahead of myself, we see flashes of the lizard approaching the house. And I guess now is a good time to finally reveal the Lizard Build-A-Figure, one of my favorite Marvel Legends. Talk about doing justice to an action figure, to a character. This is just absolutely wonderful because he's huge. I mean, you compare him to Spider-Man here. This is great. This is what a big, imposing villain should be. I love this guy. And just the way that he's put together with his not bipedal, everyone's bipedal who's walking on two legs, but the way the legs join, I don't know what you call that, like the raptor style. A lot of people say that they don't like the head or like the fact that he is very dinosaur-y, but I love Dino Lizard. I think this Velociraptor T-Rex style head is just terrific. Pass on with the long, what am I trying to say? The long bendy tongue, which is so much fun. The fact you can open up the jaws nice and wide. This figure's got so much going on. The gnarly scales on the hands. My only sort of gripe I'd say is that he needs more grubbying up. He's got like a little bit of what I would call like coffee stain. Oh, there you go. He's got like a coffee staining on his lab coat. The dude is a reptile man who lives in the sewers. Like this should be a lot dirtier. This is clearly his lab coat is Scotch guarded. I'm very impressed by this. But the rest of this is just absolutely wonderful. I love this figure. One thing that's a bit of a shame, they articulate his tail. And it's like, why can you just make a bendy tail? Like Sauron. The Sauron bath has a bendy tail. And I think that looks so much better, whereas this actually has, like hinge joints in it. I'm like, we don't really need that. The only good thing about this, though, because there's always a good side, is that, the picture's all dark, there we go, is that the tail, because it's slightly sort of more posable, you can use it to balance him. And this guy needs to be balanced, because with these feet, with all these extra hinges and the heaviness of the bath, he can be very difficult to stand, especially as I'm finding on a glass shelf, because the glass is just very slippery. So having the extra point of contact makes a big difference. But my goodness, the lizard right here, beautiful figure and a great reveal. Because as I was saying, we have a wonderful horror movie style fake out, because we see the lizard essentially stalking. It looks like he's stalking his family, Well, we don't even know that they're his family at the time. It's just a lady with a little kid. And so the lizard looks like he's just about to pounce. And then we see the mother be like, oh! And it's Spider-Man who drops down. And it's a great fake out. It's not the lizard attacking them, it's Spider-Man. He's like, hey, Mrs. Connors, this is happening. And that's when we hear some screams outside. Screams, shouts. Either way, it's Eddie Brock, still being like the sort of scumbag reporter that we're establishing him as. He's gone to look. It's funny, it's a mental sort of thing. Peter Parker, we're like, oh, he's going there to warn the family. Eddie Brock, we're like, that scumbag's going there to spy on the family. I'm terrible at profiling people, obviously. But the lizard is attacking Eddie Brock. Spider-Man comes to the rescue, comes to make the save. And as I was saying before, this is what I feel is an iconic scene for the animated series, because This fight scene between Spider-Man and the Lizard is just, oh my goodness. It is stunning animation for a Saturday morning kids cartoon. You know, it's like, okay, this isn't like Disney Lion King, but my goodness, the fluidity, the number of frames that must have been animated to capture Spider-Man's gymnastic movements, and that's the thing. They really went the extra mile to make Spider-Man Spider-Man. He's jumping and flipping and contorting. There's so much happening in the scene. There's the rain falling, even when the Lizard moves. His lab coat, his tail whipping round, the spit and drool coming from his mouth. So much happening. Peter gets smashed into a tree house and the wood all explodes and falls down. There is so much attention to detail. Just makes this scene absolutely incredible. Of course, the fight is broken up when Mrs. Connors and Billy come out of the house and the Lizard sees them, and of course he's still, you know, half the brain of Dr. Connors, you know, and he's like, you know, he sees that they are horrified by what they're looking at, and he's like, Billy, and then he runs away because he doesn't want them to see him like this. And that's where we get the nice, useful exposition dump where Mrs. Connors tells Spider-Man what happened, that Kurt experimented on himself with the Lizard serum, and this was the awful side effect. And she's like, you know, we can't go to the police. People can't know about this because they'll capture him. They'll do awful things to him. And of course, when she's saying this, Brock is just hidden in the bushes being like, oh, I'm going to tell everyone about this. But of course, Spider-Man ain't no fool. He hears Brock running away and he's like, not today, pal. And again, we get this wonderful scene where we're establishing the animosity between not just Peter Parker now, but Spider-Man and Eddie Brock. Eddie Brock's like, I got these pictures, I got this information, this is gonna be Pulitzer, baby, Pulitzer. That's a pretty good Eddie Brock, actually. At which point, of course, Spider-Man webs him up, hoists him up on a lamppost, takes his stuff, and you can understand why Brock would be, like, super pissed, because he's not actually done anything terribly wrong. He's just being a reporter and trying to be as successful as possible. And Spider-Man is, being Spider-Man, the sarcastic guy that he is, kind of a jerk. And you're like, I get it. I get why Spider-Man's doing it. He is trying to protect, you know, his friend and the father of this family and what have you. But at the same time, if you're Eddie Brock, you're like, I freaking hate this guy. If only I had a mutant symbiote alien that could bond with me and I could get some revenge. Just you wait, Brock. Just you wait. Of course, now it's always one scene connects to another very, very nicely, very, very quickly. Spider-Man is distracted again because the Lizard has kidnapped his wife. And, you know, Billy's like, he took her, Spidey, over to you, go save the day. What's nice is also before Spider-Man goes to pursue the Lizard, they actually have a very quick little exchange where he's like, I'm going to take you to a neighbour's house so you'll be safe. And it's a little attention to detail where it's like Spider-Man could have just swung off, but anyone who's like paying attention would be like, aren't you going to look after the kid or anything? So again, it's just a little bit of extra thought where it's like, no, let's actually establish that Spider-Man is responsible enough that we're going to actually leave the kid with someone who can take care of him. All right, the coolest little moment for Marvel Comics fans when Spider-Man goes into the sewer to go after the Lizard. What's the first thing he laments to himself? Why can't I be one of those galaxy-hopping superheroes? So you're like, oh, they're acknowledging other superheroes in the Marvel Universe. And then not only that, he name-checks the Avengers. He's like, and the Fantastic Four. So we're like, oh my god, like shared universe, like this is proper Marvel Universe. He's like, you never see the Fantastic Four in a sewer, you definitely never see the Avengers in a sewer. And you're like, oh my god, this is the proper Marvel Universe. Because in the X-Men cartoon, it was only ever really the X-Men. You'd see a tiny little flash, a little glimpse. There was like a little bit where you saw Spider-Man's thwipping hand once, or you saw War Machine like fly by really fast, but they never really acknowledged the wider Marvel Universe. Here, Spider-Man is straight up name-checking the Fantastic Four and the Avengers, and that just opens up so many possibilities. And then, of course, you know, he says, yeah, you would never see the Avengers in the sewer. Well, maybe the Hulk. So not only is it now also name-checking specifically the Hulk, but it's a funny little line that Spider-Man thinks to himself. Oh, can I do another check? Mwah! Chef's kiss! So while Spider-Man is going through the sewers, we have two things. First of all, his web line snaps and he mentions out loud like, oh, my webbing is losing its consistency. I must need to change cartridges, which kind of establishes kind of a plot point that you can go back to later. It's nice to give Spider-Man like a little crutch every now and then. Running out of webbing is something that we do sort of experience a lot whenever we need to kind of throw a monkey wrench in what Spider-Man is doing, but it's a nice touch. And of course now he finds the construction worker who the lizard abducted at the start of the episode. So we establish, all right, the lizard hasn't horribly mutilated him. And the guy says, all right, I've been down here for all this time. He is needing my help to build some electrical device of some sort. And when Spider-Man's like, okay, check, I'll see you later. He's like, don't just leave me here. He's like, hey, I'm a hero. So again, Spider-Man being like, hey, this is a horrible life and death situation, but relax, I'm a good guy. So now we have our scene with the lizard and his wife. It's really annoying that her name is escaping me, but we're okay. So we have the classic lizard exposition of his plan, which is the same lizard plan that we always have the first time we meet the lizard. He's going to use the mutagenic recombinator, that was one thing I remembered, to turn everyone in the world into lizards. Because that's the first solution when you have this problem of, oh, I'm a hideous man lizard. Shall I try and turn myself human again? Nope, I'll just make everyone else lizards. But of course his wife is like, yeah, that is okay, but that's not a good thing necessarily. You're going to turn your son. What about your son? What about Billy? And of course that strikes a chord with him. It's funny because his sales pitch is like, oh, it'll be wonderful, you'll be able to regrow any lost limb. And it's like, dude, I know you have a lost limb, but actually through general, the average human being doesn't actually lose their limbs that often. It's not like a top priority that we wake up every morning like, oh man, if only we could regrow lost limbs. But anyway, this is all broken up when Spider-Man swings into the rescue. Now, while Spider-Man and the lizard are fighting, the lizard's wife tries to... I've got to try and remember her name. Anyway, she tries to grab the mutagenic recombinator, and the lizard, in a fit of fury, like Spider-Man mentions that he's just gone full reptile now. And they're battling, and the lizard whips around, and his tail smashes his wife, and she goes down, and he's like, oh, Margaret! That's it, Margaret. He's like, Margaret. Of course, Spider-Man's like, hitting your wife in a fit of rage? Spider-Man would never do that. Yeah, so anyway, what happens next? The lizard is like, Margaret, how could I have done this? So eventually, as Spider-Man and the lizard both go to grab the mutagenic recombinator, they're fighting in the water. Spider-Man presses the button. It's kind of a Hail Mary thing here. He presses the button, it goes off, which I'm not sure of the science of wasn't the whole point that it was supposed to turn people into lizards? In this case, it turns the lizard back into Kurt Connors. Maybe that's why Kurt Connors needed the subway construction worker guy to help him perfect it so that it would do the opposite. So that's what I'll go for. But anyway, it goes off, we get a spectacular light show, and Spider-Man drags the now human Kurt Connors out of the water, and whew, the world is safe another day. But of course, before Spider-Man leaves the sewers, he grabs his camera, which he had webbed up to the wall. Classic Spider-Man. So he has this wonderful action shot of Spider-Man versus the lizard. And in the next scene, again, it's poor old hard luck Brock. Eddie Brock turns up to Dr. Connors' house with J. Jonah Jameson, and he's like, JJ, when you see this, you ain't gonna believe it. I'm going Taz again with my Brooklyn accent. He's like, I'm gonna show you all this thing, what I saw. And he knocks on the door, and he's like, Brock's like, if I'm wrong, I'll eat this copy of the Daily Bugle, or whatever the newspaper is. And of course, who answers the door? The very human, happy-looking Dr. Connors with Margaret, with Billy, and JJ's like, Brock, you freaking schmuck. That wasn't the exact line, but I forget. And now as the ending epilogue comes in, we go back to the Parker home with Peter Parker and Aunt May, and Peter shows Aunt May this copy of the Daily Bugle with his photo on the front page, and of course the $1,000 which he gives to Aunt May because he's Peter Parker. That's what he does. And it's a nice little ending epilogue, especially with Aunt May. Her instant reaction is not like, oh great, $1,000. It's, Peter, how did you get this picture? You're putting yourself in danger. that's way more elderly Mrs. McFly from Back to the Future 2. Oh, your father when he had that car accident because someone called him chicken. And actually what's really funny with that scene is that Aunt May, she's angry at Peter, not because he could have been savaged to death by a giant man lizard, but she's like, it's cold and dark down there. You could have got all sorts of germs. Let me make you some chicken soup. And let me rehydrate this pizza. And the final closing line from Aunt May, what if you had encountered that awful Spider-Man? Establishing that Aunt May hates Spider-Man. And one thing that we learned in my favourite comic, Amazing Spider-Man 400, is that, and I refuse to accept the retcon that this isn't the case, Aunt May knows that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, but she can't accept it. To accept it, to acknowledge it, would just be too terrifying for her. So instead, she kind of is in denial, and that's why she always talks about how much she hates Spider-Man, because she wants to kind of like get that angst out, and maybe subconsciously she's trying to convince Peter Parker to not be Spider-Man. Oh god, Amazing Spider-Man 400. One more just for the episode. Chef's kiss. Best storyline ever. Completely destroyed and retconned, which I hate. But there you go. And then, Spider-Man, we just have one final classic scene of him swinging across the city, and we are out! And that was episode 1, season 1 of Spider-Man, the animated show. Wow, what a great start. Look, Spider-Man, the lizard, this is just, what an amazing animated TV show. I swear, I would say right now, never been bettered. This is the most iconic version of Spider-Man, not just in an animated show, but ever. Like, movies, Marvel movies, MCU, Raimi, Spider-Man has never been portrayed better on screen. An adult Spider-Man, we didn't even get his origin story. Who cares? I wasn't watching this episode going like, yes, but how? How did he become Spider-Man? I don't care. I just enjoy watching Spider-Man, and this was amazing. The voice acting was on point, the character design, the integration of so much of the Marvel Universe. In the first episode, you had Peter Parker, Aunt May, Eddie Brock, Jonah Jameson, Robbie Robertson, Deborah Whitman, the Lizard, the Connors family. You had the Avengers, the Hulk, Fantastic Four, all name-checked. What an exciting way to kickstart an animated series. That is just beautiful. I haven't watched this since the mid-90s. This is the first time going back, and I'm so glad to be doing this Patreon to get the opportunity, to give myself the opportunity to watch this again. I'm digging this. We are in for a wild ride. Guys, thank you so much for signing up to the Patreon. Thank you so much for watching this and sharing it with me. I'm going to have a blast doing these episodes. I hope that you have a blast watching them. So, until next week, keep displaying model behavior.